Tony here. If you've been enjoying One Step Beyond, and especially if you enjoy the fact we don't have ads running through it, please consider dropping something in the tip jar. Think of when you encounter a busker. You like what you hear, you put some loose change in the hat, and you go about your day knowing that you're doing your own little part to encourage creativity. Just look for the Support This Show link on whatever app you're using to listen along, or visit supporter.acast.com/One Step Beyond. Thank you. And now, on with the show. Hey, you! And welcome back to One Step Beyond, a show that encourages you to take a step outside your comfort zone and enrich your life. And when I say welcome back, that's because this episode, number 29, is the second half of a two-part interview with Erin Blankenship, who co-founded Equal Playing Field, an organisation that believes that women deserve nothing less than opportunity, equality and respect across all sports, with the focus, though, very much on the beautiful game, which is, of course, football or soccer, words we'll use interchangeably in this discussion without judgment. I interviewed Erin and edited the first half of our conversation from a dining room table in Beverley, Yorkshire, England, where I was born and where I was visiting for the first time since the pandemic. And I'm now back at my regular desk in Kingston, New York, fresh off a full day of travel. And it seems an excellent time to be broadcasting this particular interview because, having just spent that month in the UK, right around the end of its traditional football season, with winners decided in domestic and Europe-wide league and cup competitions during the month of May, I've now left the country just 4 days into the month-long fiesta of international football that is Euros 2020, the name carried over from its pandemic summer postponement. For those outside Europe with perhaps only a passing interest in the game, the Euros are Europe's own World Cup, traditionally held every 4 years in between the actual World Cup finals. Of course, those inside Europe will need no introduction, the tournament being played out in public, with every game live on television, dedicated daily pull-out sections in the papers, international flags flying everywhere and home country shirts being worn accordingly. As much as it's a festival of football, I sense that this particular tournament, which has been played right across Europe, whereas the finals are usually held in a dedicated host country per the World Cup, is providing enormously overdue and welcome relief and entertainment as we hopefully gain control of the deadliest pandemic in a century. I watched a few of the opening weekend's games inside pubs that were still closed to the public only a month ago, and while I suspect that it helps with the interest in Great Britain that all three nations, England, Scotland and Wales, have qualified for the same tournament for once, England and Scotland, in fact, being in the same group, I suspect that similar enthusiasm is being exhibited all across the continent, even among and inside those countries that didn't qualify for the finals. Now, this is, of course, a men's Euros we're talking about, and though the women's game is very much on the rise in Europe, it's still playing second fiddle. Unlike in the USA, where the introduction of Title IX in the 1970s enshrined into law gender equality in school sports, introducing multiple generations of female participants into football at a young age, which led in turn to the US national women's team's international dominance. Title IX is a far cry from the ban on women's football introduced in Britain by none other than the Football Association itself, exactly 100 years ago, on the grounds that, quote, the game of football is quite unsuitable for females and ought not to be encouraged. But it's probably no coincidence that this ban came hot on the heels of rapidly rising attendances in the UK for the women's game, including a record-breaking 53,000 for a domestic match the day after Christmas 1920. It also came shortly after women gained the vote in the USA and serves as a reminder that when you challenge convention and tradition, those who hold the keys to those traditions and conventions often physically lock you out. So yes, the world remains a complicated place, and Erin has experienced and lived many of those complications, especially where it comes to gender roles. On the previous episode, she discussed her own background growing up in Saudi Arabia, her years spent playing professional football in London for top clubs, for a pittance, while earning her postgrad degree, her job as a regional peace and conflicts advisor for the World Food Programme in the Middle East, and how and why she co-founded Equal Playing Field, when a British friend, Laura Youngson, called her about 5 years ago, frustrated by the lack of media coverage of female sports. and suggested that they organise taking 2 teams of international female football players for a properly competitive 90-minute match on a full-size field in the crater atop of Mount Kilimanjaro, to prove that women could reach higher than men if they so chose. And this was by far and away the highest altitude game of football ever attempted. Since that successful adventure, Equal Playing Field has broken 4 more world records. We'll reconvene with the first on Kili in this episode, and then we'll talk more about the second one in particular. After which Erin will detail how Equal Playing Field helps make a difference at the grassroots level, and we'll look at how far the women's game has come internationally and the challenges it still faces. So with that, let's get ready to go.
One step beyond!
You mentioned about taking a movie crew, a documentary crew up Kilimanjaro, and I'm sure anybody who listens to this is just immediately thinking, "I want to see this. I want to, I want to see these people." I mean, I'm presuming you didn't leave any dead bodies up there.
No, we all survived. It was
right.
Great, yes.
So you did it in 2017. Can we see a movie yet?
Absolutely. So Be in Sports did the documentary, that first documentary for. It's about an hour long. They still have it on their website. And if you Google Be in Sports Kilimanjaro Equal Playing Field, it'll pop up and you can still see it. There is also actually a film, a documentary storytelling film that's just been released or is coming out this year. That's being done by another independent director who's covered multiple journeys of ours. So both Jordan and Kilimanjaro. And this is a story that's more about 5 or 6 of the key women sort of storytellers within Equal Playing Field and sort of how they got to the mountain, why they were participating as a different perspective. And that's also called Equal Playing Field. We are very fortunate that people actually want to tell our story.
Right.
We have a couple of good journalists that we work with regularly. We have our own media team that covers footage and stories, but to have other people who really want to push the boundaries of how it can be shared is amazing.
I didn't get to see much by comparison about going down to the Dead Sea, and that did pose its own challenges in its own ways, though, from what I read. So can you talk about those?
Sure. The Dead Sea project was not really planned in the same way that Kilimanjaro was. So Kilimanjaro, we had about a year and a half where we were building everything and putting it together. The Dead Sea came about because we had 2 Jordanian national team players that came with us to Kilimanjaro, and they came home heroes. The country, they were on every radio show, every TV program. These women have just completely transformed themselves, the conversation around women in football. And as part of that, they were actually supported under the King Hussein Foundation, helped give them some of their funding to be able to go. And when we came back, Prince Ali bin Al Hussein, who is the head of the Jordanian FA and a huge advocate for women's sport in his country and globally, reached out through his network to say, I was incredibly impressed and proud of what our team and you were all able to achieve. Is there any way we could do something similar here in Jordan? I want to make a statement for women's football. Jordan had just hosted the Under-17 Women's World Cup. You had girls pulling in thousands of spectators in a Middle Eastern country. This was momentum to be built on. And so 9 months later, we found ourselves on our second world record challenge. And the program we came up with was to do something really specific for the region, right? So the Middle East and North Africa is not a part of the world where female athletes are encouraged. For the most part, they are generally underestimated. Women full stop are underestimated and underrepresented. So this project, we recruited women primarily from the Middle East and North Africa. So more than 11 countries just within that region. We had 7 or 8 hijabi athletes, referees, and medics. But we did a 100-kilometer hike down the Jordan Desert, working with Bedouin communities, running camps for girls. So, introduce them to the game, playing exhibition games so that these communities could see women and women from their own part of the world compete at a very high level. And then we managed to work with the Ministry of Youth to get a field built in an underprivileged community at the Dead Sea. So the lowest the lowest point on Earth. So almost 500 meters below sea level. We played in a desert community that never even had a field before. And it was quite a conversation to tell the people who live there, like, actually, the boys aren't allowed to play on it yet. The girls will be the first people to play on this field, and explaining why.
The fact is, different parts of the world have different cultural values.
When you work in a part of the world like Jordan, as comparatively progressive and forward-thinking as it is, you still have to have a conversation with every father. You still have to sort of explain how the girls will be safe, and that this isn't an insult. That they need to be proud of them. It's a conversation about introducing a totally different way of thinking about girls and women in their communities, and doing so in a way that makes them feel comfortable.
So those were some of the cultural issues faced by the Dead Sea hike. On top of those,
you had the logistical challenges of hiking 20-kilometer days and playing a game and running a camp for 300 girls in the middle of a camel track. But you also had this overarching message for this one was like, this is a region that needs to have a little bit of a spotlight on it in terms of what women have accomplished, what they are doing, what they are capable of doing. And that was harder for people who had not been in the Middle East before, right? Like, more conservative dress. It was 100 degrees out there. We're running camps. And I'm like, guys, you're wearing pants.
I do hope the American listeners to this show will forgive me for the fact I'm about to intrude and note that pants is one of the biggest discrepancies between the English and American languages. The word pants actually comes from pantaloons, which means long trousers. It does not mean, as the rest of the world might believe it to mean, underpants.
You're wearing pants out there. I know it's hot, but we have to find a way to meet them in the middle ground. And so there's a lot of that went on with Jordan and within the Dead Sea Challenge that we didn't have with Kili. So it was different.
So you're not dealing obviously with altitude, but you're dealing with heat, and you're dealing with the exhaustion of the hike. You're dealing with the desert and incredibly dry. Is that something? Very,
very, very dry. Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
And we actually got our route was displaced within the first day because of a windstorm. The wind was so bad that people were literally, we had some players that were quite petite and they were literally getting blown towards cliffs. So we had to reroute where we camped for the night in this abandoned old restaurant that hadn't been completed yet. Right.
Right.
We camped out on the floor of this building that was on the, the edge of a desert scope, and reorientated. But yeah, that kind of adaptability and your susceptibility to the weather and Mother Nature is, it comes much more clear when you're sitting in a desert. You're like, and you're carrying your water and all the rest of it.
And I think you're speaking to just something in general that I think is wonderful, which is that when you take on some kind of adventure, but you add meaning to it, the adventure presumably becomes more enjoyable. It's maybe the challenge of getting through it is like, well, I'm not going to fail at this because we've added meaning to this challenge.
No, absolutely. And I think that meaning, it becomes your rock, right? Like there are a lot of times where we could have or should have potentially turned away or stopped, right? Or, sort of called it quits. But when you're part of something bigger, that meaning, the reason you're there, the reason that you're hiking or playing the game, gives you a bit of inner strength and focus to be like, all of that is true. I'm still going to do it. I'm still going to be a part of not just this internal commitment to the mandate, but I have a team around me who's doing the same thing. We are all here for a collective purpose and goals. And that is where I think you can find another set of legs, right?
Yeah.
Your second wind, your third wind, your fifth wind, to be able to overcome the obstacles that you're facing.
You sent me some links to some of the programs, some of the camps that you've been involved with. And if I got it right, one was South Africa, which you mentioned earlier, and one of them was Mexico. But the one that I found most interesting is partly because we did a story a little bit on this before. My nephew went off to work as a volunteer on the Greek islands, on the island of Samos. That would be episode 18, not the Samos it ever was, about the now, unfortunately, largely forgotten refugee crisis that's hit Europe, Greek islands in particular, and my younger nephew's very own small part in doing his best to help with it. This video is a feature on an Afghan woman whose husband, as she says, was taken by the Taliban and martyred. which is one way of saying he was murdered. And she fled with her kid to Greece, where the camps are no fun. They're subject to all kinds of hostilities. And I guess she had never played football before. And just talk me a little bit through what you're doing, or what Equal Playing Field is contributing to making that change on the ground, because that was the story that I found most powerful out of those video clips.
So the team in Greece is a project that is run as a combination between a group called Hestia FC and the International Olympic Truce Group. And they started a women's refugee football program a couple of years ago. And we came across them through a Sport for Development forum that happens sort of on an annual basis in Germany. Well, many countries have them, but we met Hestia when we participated in the Street Football World forum there. And when I reached out to the head of the Hestia FC club, I was like, I love what you're doing. We shared, she'd been working with the refugee population in Greece for over a decade. And I had obviously worked in most of the countries that her refugees were coming from. And so I wanted to find out if there was a way that we could support what they were doing, find some funding, get it into their system, and then sort of have a platform for them to talk about what they were doing in a way that they would never have the same audience before. And that's a lot of what we do. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel. Most of these organizations have phenomenal expertise. They know exactly what they're doing. What they really need are resources and an ability to connect with other people who feel passionately about what they're doing. And so that program is very near and dear to most of our hearts. Many of us have either worked in those countries or can certainly sympathize with the experience, or are coming from also refugee host countries, right? So all across Europe, you have stories like that play out. And sport is this unbelievable power for most of these women who have been told the majority of their lives that they are lesser than, they don't have the right to be on the field. And what we've seen with a lot of those refugee programs, we've worked with teams in the camps in Jordan for Syrian refugees, so Azraq and a couple others, is that once the girls start to play, their moms come and watch the practices, and then the moms wanted to play. So all of a sudden they see this transformation in their daughters becoming more confident, have better self-esteem, doing better in school, being able to communicate more openly with people, and they want to be a part of that. They want to also have that experience. You know, the woman that we spoke with in Greece was one phenomenal story, but she's one of many. You've got this whole pool of people whose lives have been transformed by what sport gives them, and it's awesome.
Right. Let's move into a final part here, and sticking with football. I know that we're talking Equal Playing Field it's about women's sports, as a whole, but you have chosen to focus on football, and all the world records have involved football. So I want to just take a minute for you to offer an opinion on how things have changed for the better, say since you started playing professionally, semi-professionally, £40 a match in the UK. And where there are still just gross injustices that need to be corrected.
So I think on the pro side that we're at a point in history where you don't get to dial it back again, right? So there have been several renditions of this conversation, at least the last many decades, of women in sport, and it tends to come up around really superb female athletes who start hitting benchmarks, like the Serena Williams of the world, or Billie Jean King, or the women's U.S. national football team. I feel finally that we are at a point where you don't get to ignore this anymore. There will be change. It doesn't get to be another league that sort of falls apart because there's insufficient resources. I mean, the U.S. women's professional league in the United States has gone through like 4 or 5 pilot projects before they actually hit their stride where they are now. And I don't think they're not turning back. So that's a positive. The investment is starting to come. It's slow. It's a slow trickle effect. And I think that there's massive opportunity for that to continue to grow. But we are still dealing with institutional structures, at least at the international and even national team level, where the accountability for not investing in women's football and the way that female athletes are treated within those systems is still way, way off the mark. And I'm not sure if you saw it, but within the last couple years, the indictment by FIFA of the head of the Afghan women's football program, right, for sexual abuse against players for years, right? And the reporting mechanism at the time was that if a girl had a complaint against someone in the federation, she had to go to actually the person who had been committing the offense, right? There was no safe reporting mechanism. And that's not just women's football, that's women's sport across the board, right? That's really systematic. That kind of lack of access or lack of accountability is something that I think is very serious.
This particular case of which Erin speaks is much more than merely serious. It's utterly horrific. It was broken by The Guardian back in November 2018. A former women's head of the Afghan Football Federation actually had to flee the country because she found out in the course of her investigation claims of physical abuse, sexual abuse, death threats, and rape. I'll put a link to the Guardian story in the show notes. And in the meantime, let's get back to the business of women playing football rather than the unfortunate, often sexual and physical abuse heaped upon them.
I would also say that we are running some risk of having women's football or women's sport follow the exact same pathway as men's sport. And it's a very interesting dialogue in that, there are things about women's sport and women's football that are different and probably better than the systems and sort of structures that have been pushed forward for the last 100 years in the men's game. My biggest worry are the pathways to getting to the professional game. I think we do pretty well in theory on getting grassroots options, like that's getting better. The recognition for equal pay and, parity on field access or travel or hotels, et cetera, is, at least it's a conversation now, and countries, certain countries have started to shift it, right? So New Zealand, Norway, the UK, even in this first year, is the first year they have the same performance payment to their athletes for participating in international matches between the men's and women's teams.
This is essentially true, though I do feel compelled to point out that because there is not a UK women's team, it's actually the English FA, the same English FA that banned women from playing on Football League grounds a century ago, is now paying women and men the same amount to play for their country, and indeed bonuses too. That sounds laudable. They're joined by Australia, New Zealand, Brazil and Norway at my last count. However, the disparity in tournament prize money is enormous. Essentially, the French got almost 10 times as much money for winning the Men's World Cup in 2018 as the American Soccer Federation got for winning the Women's World Tournament in 2019. On a domestic level, I was down on the south coast in England just a few days before recording this, just outside Brighton. There is a town called Lewes. Their football club claims to be the first in the UK to be paying men and women the same amount.
The sponsorships are still grossly imbalanced, but the movement is starting. But it's the pathways in the middle, which I think are really, really difficult on the women's side, because you're also dealing with all of the cultural and social taboos around being a female in your teens, 20s, 30s, 40s who wants to play and participate in sport, and you don't really have those options. So when I look at FIFA or the other structures out there that are supposed to be growing the game, my question mark is like, where are their channels? Where can people after the age of 12 continue to play if they're not going to be on a professional team? When you start to have that comparability between the men's and women's sides, I think that will be a benchmark to really measure some success by.
Yeah, and there's so many areas we could go off and talk about there, because it's really struck me as we were talking that the football is governed by men in suits, and there's a lot of sexism, historical sexism, and cultural prejudice that comes with that. And thinking about FIFA, which is kind of been proven to be corrupt from top to bottom, and it's a corrupt organization of men. So when I'm hearing you saying we don't want to just go down that path, I think that was a really important point, because otherwise you're just being governed by the men.
And that in and of itself is a really fierce debate, right? Because and you see this even with the way that the women's teams are named when they're coming out of like men's clubs. Like, and at the professional club level, you see, like, is this Man United women's side and Man United men's side, or do you call it something different? Do you create a totally different governing structure? And on the one hand, there's reason to argue for, yes, separating them. And on the other hand, it's like the moment you separate them, your access to budget goes to 1%. But the moment you because that's happened quite a bit in both at the national and the professional club level, where you just are like, oh, here's the women's side. And because they only get 300 fans a week, this is how much budget they're going to get. And you can't overcome those obstacles if you only have so much access to the bandwidth of focus of the people in charge.
Right. I think you're talking a lot about chicken and egg here, because the reason a game might get 300 supporters is because there's not the investment, exactly. So there's not the advertising, there's maybe not the the sport is maybe not at a level that, right. that hasn't had the chance to grow. You see it in the United States. The investment was made. Title IX had something to do with it. Girls gravitated to the sport. You end up not only with the greatest team in the world, but you also end up with that team as role models, and that's it's an expression we haven't used yet, but maybe a good place to end, because the American women's football team are role models for a couple of generations of girls, a few generations of girls. And I think that's really, really, really important. They look up to the women sports figures just as much as they would a woman, a female musician, actress, anything that you want to mention. Yeah,
exactly. And the power of a role model, right? And maybe we get a little cynical about that as we get older, because we're disillusioned by the systems. But the absolute inspirational capacity of someone doing something that you admire as a kid is just, it changes the way you look at the world. It changes the way you think about yourself, the way you think about other people. And it's something that we should not be taking for granted. And then Laura, my other co-founder for Equal Playing Field, she, in one interview that she did in our first year, she's like, you know what? I really don't want to be having this conversation in 50 years. That's my mark of a success. Like, I don't want my daughters or granddaughters, I don't want any younger generation girl to think that there had ever been a time where they weren't considered equal to their male counterparts on anything that they decided to do. I want to get over this. I just want to play football. I want to be considered, for my talent, my hard work, and have access to the game that I love. Full stop. That's it. And in doing that, and in fighting for that, and for that purpose, I think you really do give voice to generations of people who are looking at this in a very different way. And it's exciting. When Holland won the Women's Euros back in the day, their immediate enrollment numbers for women's football went up by 9% within 3 months of them having won, right? They came to a big, an emperor's welcome, right? 1 million people in the public parks, all dressed in orange, screaming their names of their team that came through, shifted. And all of a sudden you saw this just huge interest from an increase in interest from girls and women, a shift in investment in the climate for growing the game. And now, they were in the last final of the World Cup as one of a serious competitive team. It's great to see how quickly that can happen.
I guess a final question is probably a really obvious one. Is there another world record in the offing?
Absolutely.
And can you tell us what it is?
England will be hosting the Women's Euros next summer. And so we have been devising some plans for that. And I'm not going to give them away, but it'll be, I think, an incredible opportunity to reflect on everything that has changed for the good in women's football. And we plan to do it in the UK. We actually have been in talks with women's rugby and cricket as well, to sort of talk about as a more collective women in sport platform. And it's exciting. We always have records up our sleeves. We love the challenge. So the Women's World Cup in Australia, New Zealand, the Women's Euros in the UK as the big elite level competitions, but there's a couple live volcanoes globally that have enough space for a pitch. So we've been looking at those. We have some ideas.
We're going to have fun following that as well. Thank you so much for taking time out. I know you're traveling next week to a conflict zone, so I really appreciate you took the time on this. And again, thank you for all that you've done and that you're doing, and for just making it inspirational and entertaining at the same time. It's wonderful. Thank you so much, Erin.
Thank you so much for reaching out and for an opportunity to speak with you. It's always a pleasure to have a chance to talk about the incredible people I'm working with and the stuff we get to do, because we're crazy enough to try it.
You are indeed. So don't ever stop being crazy.
That's the main takeaway.
You can find out a lot more about Equal Playing Field by just going to equalplayingfield.com. But I will also put a whole bunch of links to various articles and videos, etc., social media, pertaining to the various issues that Erin has discussed during our wonderful interview. Thank you again to her for her time. I will say again that one of the great things about doing this show is that I get an education. I know a lot more about the women's game now than I did previously. I still don't know enough, but it sent me down a rabbit hole of discovery, and I really look forward to watching more games on national and international competitive levels in the future. Two podcasts I have been listening to quite a lot, though, over the last year and a half that are completely focused on women's sports are Keeping Track. 3 Olympians from 2 countries, including 2 moms and 1 current pro, come together to talk about the inspiring figures, important topics and interesting stories in women's sports. The other one is Burn It All Down, which describes itself as the feminist sports podcast you need. Both come highly recommended from me. Links to those will also be in the show notes. I mentioned last time out that I might take the Zoom recorder out on one of my adventures in the UK. I did intend to do that. I had this wonderful 10 hours on my feet. The 3rd Saturday I was up in the Yorkshire area, went out to the North York Moors, to the absolutely picturesque, beautiful village of Rosedale Abbey. Had myself a wonderful 10 hours on my feet in training for Manitou's Revenge, which takes place the last weekend of June. It was not quite like training in the Catskills, but it was great training nonetheless. There was very little phone service while I was there, so my original map that I had drawn on all trails got kind of thrown to the wind. I had to act on instinct, frequently found myself off footpaths, found myself out on the moors, found myself wandering through woods, and a point that I was going through what was an official trail but was a narrow, and by narrow I mean a 5-inch wide, maybe 3-inch wide gap through the heather on the moor between Rosedale Abbey and Lastingham. My phone died on me completely, had to double back, had to then take the wider path down to Lastingham. It was one of those kind of days where it was just utterly beautiful. It was a Saturday. There were quite a lot of people out, though not on the 5-inch or 3-inch wide patches of heather, but there were a lot of people around Rosedale Abbey itself. I found it quite a lively little village, actually. There were at least 1 or 2 caravan parks alongside it and camping sites, and it gave the place a bit more life than the other villages I'd been to in the previous weekends. There was a 9-hole golf course on the hill out of town. Sure, it's quite hard playing golf on a hill. This hill climbed 500 feet in about half a mile. So the golf was a bit of a challenge. I'm sure it was even more of a challenge given that when I did climb through it, every single golfer seemed to have a bottle of beer in their hand. It was that kind of day, that kind of place. God knows I wandered around. I covered a lot of miles, but the intention was really to spend the time on my feet. So some of it was hiking, some of it was running. All of it was fun. And the thing that struck me most about it was this aspect that we haven't been able to travel because of the pandemic, and this is all too sadly true. This whole trip was my first flight in almost 18 months. I usually go back to the UK way more often than that. It felt like going back to Beverley in Yorkshire was not somewhere new to me, not being in my mother's house. And yet all 3 villages I went to and based my runs on I hadn't been to before. And I'd never, despite many years of intending it, never really treated myself to that full day on the York moors. I wasn't quite out on the wild and windy moors that Kate Bush sung about, but it was close enough at times. And it really struck me that we can talk and aspire to traveling abroad, and there are still so many more places I want to go in the world, like everywhere. But there's travel to be had at home. And the same way that last summer, necessity being the mother of invention, I had my first ever vacations in New Hampshire and Rhode Island. And more recently, this late winter spring, got up to a part of the Adirondacks I'd never been to before. It was amazing that it was only an hour and a half's drive from Beverly to Rosedale Abbey. And yet it was somewhere utterly and totally brand new for me. And God knows I had the greatest day out there. I, again, made it all the more fun, if also all the more challenging by the fact that I either didn't have phone service or my phone decided to die at the very point I was charging it. My best memory might actually be, apart from chatting with some friendly people, when I did get down to Lustingham, going in this pub to just get my water refilled, I had taken a bank card with me. I swear it was all I could do not to just say, you know what, take the bank card, pour me a pint of bitter and give me whatever chips, French fries you got and whatever veggie burger, vegan burger you got with that. I did resist the temptation. I rewarded myself instead on the drive back by stopping in the town of Malton, named for the malt, and going to the Brass Castle Brewery, which is an all-vegan, all-gluten-free brewery and one of the very, very best craft breweries in Britain. And sitting there in the window and watching the world go by. Obviously, I only had the one beer. I still had more distance to drive home, but managed to bring a few more with me. I then brought those down to the south coast when I finally got a break over my final weekend, just as the Euros were starting. Had the great fun of going to Brighton, a place I do know very, very well, meeting with one other very best friend there, watching the England game in a pub there, and also getting some running out on the south coast around the village of Hoo, which is spelled H-O-O-E, which I swear sounds like hooey, but running in some different kind of fields and footpaths than I had up in Yorkshire, and just staying really fit in that regard. I think I'm about as well trained for Manitou's Revenge as I can be under these circumstances. And finally, I also had this sort of double header where, having not been on a bus or a tube in either New York City or London, of course, bus or subway in New York City or bus or underground in London in 18 months, I managed to do both in 24 hours. The night I left, I parked up at Heathrow at a cheap hotel, caught the bus and the underground into London to Piccadilly Circus to meet with some very best friends there because I couldn't really turn up the chance. And the next day, flying back to New York City, caught the bus and the subway to Port Authority, and then said, you know what? I watched the 8 o'clock game. I watched the last game of the Euros yesterday in London. I'm going to watch today's last game of the Euros in New York City because it just makes me feel like an international jet setter, which I'm really, really not. But it was nice to feel that way anyway. I went to the place called Beer Authority, right opposite Port Authority, to watch the second half of France versus Germany. I have to say the conversation with Erin has made me all the more aware of football's appeal all across the board, the challenges it faces, the triumphs it can inspire, and I got home tired but happy. I thank everybody for listening to the show as always, and I'll see you next time here for One Step Beyond. Remember, take it easy and take a step outside your comfort zone. It may just enrich your life. One Step Beyond is written, produced and narrated by Tony Fletcher. Incidental music is by Noel Fletcher, unless otherwise stated. The theme song is by Madness, used with permission, and the logo is by Mark Lerner. Special thanks to Radio Kingston for airing these episodes and for supplying studio space when not under lockdown. If you like what you hear, please consider throwing us a tip via the Support This Show button on your phone or by visiting supporter.acast.com/onestepbeyond lowercase. You can also hit the subscribe button and or leave a positive rating and or review. It all helps. One Step Beyond is on social media, mainly on Instagram. Just search One Step Beyond with Tony Fletcher there or on Facebook and Twitter and we should come up straight away. to subscribe to a newsletter, to reach out via email, and especially if you're interested in sponsorship opportunities, the address is onestepbeyond@ijamming.net. One Step Beyond is available on just about every podcast platform known to man, and most likely a few that have yet to be discovered. Until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, and stay active.